Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today to discuss a profoundly important book, Our Own Worst Enemy: The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, by Tom Nichols. As a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and a staff writer at The Atlantic, Nichols brings a sharp, contrarian perspective to the challenges facing liberal democracies today. His central thesis is both provocative and sobering. The greatest threat to democracy comes not from external forces or elite conspiracies, but from within, from the citizens themselves. Let's dive into the theses, arguments, examples, and key takeaways of this compelling work. Nichols argues that the rise of illiberal and anti-democratic movements in the United States and other democracies is not primarily the result of external pressures like globalization or the missteps of elites, as many claim. Instead, he places the blame squarely on ordinary citizens, whose growing narcissism, anger, and resentment have fueled a rejection of democratic values such as compromise, altruism, and civic virtue. He contends that in an era of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and technological advancement, citizens have become complacent, entitled, and resistant to change, undermining the very system that has enabled their freedoms. As Nichols quotes Abraham Lincoln, "If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." Democracy, he asserts, is inherently fragile because its greatest battle is with itself, its reliance on the active, virtuous participation of its citizens. Nichols structures his argument around several interconnected points, each highlighting how cultural and societal shifts have eroded democratic foundations. Nichols posits that the relative peace and affluence of the modern era have paradoxically weakened democracy. He draws on the concept of hedonic adaptation, where people become accustomed to high living standards and demand ever more, fostering a sense of entitlement and dissatisfaction despite objective improvements in quality of life. For example, he notes that despite surviving global conflicts, economic crises, and pandemics, many Americans perceive their circumstances as near apocalyptic, a perception amplified by social media and a culture of grievance. Nichols argues that social media has exacerbated narcissistic tendencies and social isolation, creating a terrible confluence of loving oneself more while loving one's neighbor less. Platforms like Twitter and Facebook enable performative outrage and echo chambers, where citizens prioritize personal grievances over collective well-being. This hyperconnectivity, he suggests, deprives people of the ability to pause, deliberate, and engage in reasoned discourse, turning adults into children entranced by colorful pictures who impulsively hit the like button. Nichols laments the erosion of civic-minded behavior, contrasting modern apathy with past generations' participation in community organizations like the Elks or local government. He compares contemporary democracies to the Italian village of Montejano, described by Edward Banfield in the 1950s, where residents prioritize personal and familial interests over collective good, leading to stagnation. Nichols sees a similar tribalism in today's voters, who often vote against their own interests out of spite or tribal loyalty. Nichols points to the rise of populist and authoritarian figures, such as Donald Trump in the US or leaders in Hungary and India, as evidence of citizens' willingness to embrace illiberalism. He argues that voters, driven by anger and nostalgia for a mythologized good old days, support candidates who promise disruption over cooperation. This nostalgia, often tinged with racist or nativist undertones, ignores the reality that life has improved for many, and it fuels a desire for social revenge against perceived elites. Perhaps Nichols' most chilling observation is that a society that is post-factual is pre-fascist. When citizens prioritize feelings and conspiracies over facts, they become susceptible to demagogues who exploit rage rather than reason. Nichols cites the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot as a stark example of how unchecked anger and misinformation can threaten democratic institutions. The central takeaway from Our Own Worst Enemy is that democracy's survival depends on the active, virtuous participation of its citizens. Nichols urges us to reject narcissism, cynicism, and nostalgia, and to revive the civic virtues of altruism, compromise, stoicism, and cooperation. He proposes practical solutions such as electoral reforms, e.g., statehood for Puerto Rico and D.C., expanding the House, and mandatory civic service for young people to foster a sense of shared responsibility. Above all, Nichols calls for self-reflection. We must look in the mirror and recognize that we are the problem before we can become the solution.